Welcome to Release to Results. It's a Course in Miracles. It's less than 70. My salvation comes from me. So, how long have you been telling yourself that your salvation comes from somewhere else? What kinds of things have you been holding as the source of your salvation, your okayness? And that's okay. It happens. We all get convinced that the solution is somewhere out there at one time or another in our lives. And today is about looking for the solution within. My salvation comes from me. It cannot come from anywhere else. Now, again, the Course in Miracles says right up front, you might reject some of these ideas. You might resist them. You might not like them. It matters not. Could you allow what comes up for you and use it? Use it to come to this place of finding your salvation within. So use whatever comes up for you today with the letting go process. What is the letting go process? It's allowing any of these feelings to come up that have been stuck, that have been obscuring these clouds that have been covering your light of the world that you are. Could you allow them to come up and allow them to dissipate and to pass just by sitting with them for a moment? That's all letting go is letting feelings be there and letting them go by letting them be there and they go on their own. The same thing comes with your salvation. If you could just let anything that appears outside of you to be the source of your well-being, your life, notice the feelings about that dependency, that separation, letting it up, sitting with it and letting it go to come back to the wholeness and the oneness that you are. So let us begin with lesson 70. My salvation comes from me. My salvation comes from me. It cannot come from anywhere else. All temptation is nothing more than some form of the basic temptation not to believe the idea for today. Salvation might seem to come from anywhere except from you. Could you allow the recognition, just for right now, that my salvation comes from me, nowhere else? Could you open up to this idea that salvation comes from you? Just allowing yourself to repeat this idea, my salvation comes from me. I am the light. Salvation comes from me. Salvation of the world, the salvation of myself. It cannot come from anywhere else. My salvation comes from me. My salvation comes from me. And any rejection of this idea, that's okay. Any guilt or smallness is only an invention of your own mind. Could you allow up any rejection, any refusal, any resistance to the idea that salvation comes from you? It's okay. Could you allow up any clouds that would cover your light? And going behind any thoughts, pictures, images, you just notice how it feels to be blocking the source of salvation, yourself. Could you let this energy, this feeling run? And could you let it pass, let it go? Yes or no is fine. Would you let it go if you could and be the source of salvation. Allow that. My salvation comes from me. It cannot come from anywhere else. My salvation comes from me, though perhaps I have perceived that in some way I'm guilty, bad, wrong, or small, and that couldn't be so. And that's okay. Could I allow up to my awareness now something that's obscuring my light and my function of salvation? Could I allow myself to go behind the thoughts, the images, and notice how it feels to be blocking my function? Could I allow whatever this energy is, wherever it seems to be stored or hanging out, and could I allow myself to just sit in awareness of this feeling? And could I let it go? Could I release this block to my function? Would I let it go? I can make a choice to keep it or to let it go, to release it or not. Would I release it? And be in my function. My salvation comes from me. My salvation comes from me. And I may have been tempted at times to not believe this idea or even to reject it. What comes up for me when I am rejecting the idea of today, not believing my salvation comes from me? What small thing, what smallness, what guilt could keep me from believing this idea? My salvation comes from me. And without judging or moralizing, further attacking or condemnation of myself, could I simply go behind this idea and notice how it feels to believe other than my salvation comes from me? Could I open up and let this cloud come up, this darkness, bring it up to the light just by noticing it, feeling it, being aware of it? And could I surrender, refusing, resisting my function, my salvation coming from me? Just turning it over. Would I surrender? Give up this smallness, this non belief in my salvation coming from me? I never have to. And when could I surrender this smallness, this guilt, and be my salvation? Could it it be that easy? Could it be true? My salvation comes from me. Though it may be the case, and it's okay, it's happened, where there's this idea that my salvation comes from something external, some other person, these possessions, money, medicines. Nothing wrong with any of those. Just noticing when I'm placing or you're placing your salvation externally and just allowing yourself to bring up anything that comes up that you have been handing your salvation over to, where you've looked for salvation in the past, places, people, possessions, events. Could you just notice with an open presence anything you've been attributing to your salvation to externally? And taking one of those things, could you notice how it feels to be handing your salvation over to something outside of you? What feeling would drive you outside for salvation? Could you notice that feeling of giving away salvation, its possibility to this thing, person, place outside of you? Could you allow it up? And could you let go of making your salvation come from this thing outside of you? Would you let go, if you could, of looking for salvation outside, externally? When could you let go of looking elsewhere than yourself for salvation? For your salvation cannot come from any of these things. Your salvation comes from you and only from you. The idea is my salvation comes from me. Your salvation comes from you. Though how often have you or me put our salvation outside of us, look to someone else to save us, look to something out there to save us? It's okay, without condemning, judging further. Could you just notice something that you claimed will save you outside of yourself? And can you notice behind placing your salvation in this thing outside, any energy that would drive you to do that, any feeling? Could you sit with this feeling for but a moment, a cloud of darkness passing? And could you release it? Just could you release looking for salvation outside, externally? Would you release the idea or the concept or the belief that something out there is your salvation and allow your salvation to come from you? You. Could you allow this idea that your salvation comes from you? My salvation comes from me. It cannot come from any of these things outside, externally. My salvation comes from me and only me. My salvation comes from me. And could you notice any time where you've believed, been tempted to believe that your salvation lies externally in a person, a place, a thing, possessions, events, and without making right or wrong of it, could you simply notice the energy, the feeling that would drive you to believe salvation somewhere else outside of you? Could you let the thoughts, pictures, illusions pass by and just notice this feeling, this energy that would have you looking everywhere but within for salvation? Could you just hold it gently, noticing it, witnessing this feeling that had you lost? And could you surrender this feeling, looking outside of yourself for salvation to God? Could you turn it over? Would you make a choice to surrender, following the temptation to believe in some external source of salvation? When could you surrender and be salvation? My salvation comes from me. And going through the day today, you might notice it seeming like something outside of you could save you. You may notice it seems like there's some kind of resistance to this idea that salvation is inherent within your being, already done. And that's okay. Could you allow up anything that comes up, letting it go as you're willing, as you're ready? And you might tell yourself, my salvation comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Within me is the world's salvation and my own. Could you be salvation today? Could it be within you? And could you say, be the world's salvation and your own? Your salvation comes from you. Well done releasing. Thank you for joining us, and we'll do it again tomorrow.